Joining us on the line from the UK is Glyn Iliffe to talk about his latest book, The Oracles of Troy. Glyn studied English and classics at Reading University, where he developed a passion for the stories of ancient Greek mythology. His series, The Adventures of Odysseus, have sold over 80,000 copies to date worldwide, and book 4 is out now. As I said, it's called The Oracles of Troy. Welcome to the book show, Glyn.
Hi, Hannah.
Hi, it's great to have you with us. And how does it feel to be on book 4?
Very good, actually. It's nice. It's a very long process writing any books, and for me it usually takes about 18 months. So I'm glad to be this side of the writing process and having it out there published.
Yeah. So when you first started the very first book in the series, which was King of Ithaca, did you know there was going to be a certain amount of books in a series?
Yes, I did. I planned it all out. When I had the original idea to do a series of books about the Trojan War, the myths cover 30 years, really, so I couldn't really do it in one. When I looked at it, I knew it had to be 6 books in total. Yeah, so I had to plan them all out.
And why did you decide that you wanted to write about Greek mythology?
Well, I've got an interest that goes back to childhood, actually, from watching films like Jason and the Argonauts as a kid. That's when the interest in the ancient world started. And that developed over the years, and eventually I ended up doing it at university, as you've already mentioned. I studied classical studies there. And once I got out of university, and I'd always wanted to be a writer as well, ever since primary school, I married the two together. So the idea of writing a series of books on the Trojan War was, well, they say write what you know, and having done 3 years studying the stuff, it seemed quite logical, really.
Yeah. And do you have to do quite a lot of research for books like this?
Yeah, I think I benefited from spending 3 years surrounded by people studying it and lectures and so on and so forth. So you get a real feel for the era, for the period, if you like. But obviously you do need to do quite a bit of research. Most of my research was done with the first book, in the build-up to King of Ithaca. And that took quite a while, a lot of reading around and so on, rereading of Homer several times, a lot of note-taking. But with the later books, with this one, The Oracles of Troy, it was much less, actually, because I've done most of the work a few years back.
And do you think there's a lot out there that people don't know and potentially should know about Greek mythology? I mean, I think most people will know the name Troy, will have heard of Achilles and the King of Ithaca, but do you think there's so much more that needs to be told?
Exactly, actually, yeah. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to write the series of books, because I'm such a fan of Homer and Greek mythology. But there are so many myths, especially about the Trojan War. It's Homer's books, the Iliad and the Odyssey, are the equivalent to the Bible for ancient Greeks. It was the foundation stone. His poems were the foundation stone of their culture. So there's hundreds and hundreds of myths which most of us today are unaware of. And the whole idea of this series was to tell the whole story in one narrative over 6 books and bring in as many of those lesser-known myths as I possibly could.
And have you succeeded thus far, do you think? Is it going well?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it's there's a few you have to miss out, but not that many. Sometimes, with the recent book, for example, there's a scene where this Trojan prophet keeps pointing at the Trojan horse and saying it's full of Greek warriors and so on, and the gods send a big sea serpent and snatch him off into the sea and drown him. But I couldn't have him in the book. I had to drop him because there are so many other prophets, other seers and soothsayers in the story that it was too many. But most of the smaller, lesser-known myths I do manage to get in, and it's quite good fun trying to pack them all in. But you do need to try and tell your own story in that as an author. Obviously, I've got my own slight take on it, and because all these different myths were told by different people over the centuries, some Romans, some Greeks, some poets, some playwrights and so on. You're trying to bring them all together, all these different stories, into one single story. You have to cut a few corners and bash things around a little bit so it all fits in neatly.
So are you making up parts of the story, or have they all come from books?
The main elements of the story are all from mythology. Yeah, all from mythology. I have added in a couple of characters because the main character is actually Odysseus, as you've mentioned, and a lot of people roughly know what his fate is. They know what happens to him. So to keep people guessing, I've included another character called Apparatus, who is Odysseus' sidekick, if you like. He's the captain of his guard. And because he is completely my own invention, readers can invest in him emotionally, if you like. They can be really interested in what happens to him, but they won't know what his actual story is. So it's good to have that additional element in it.
Mm. And what do we know about the Trojan Horse? Because you talk about the fact that it was one of the most infamous deceptions in history. What do you mean by that? Or that would give too much away?
I don't think so. I think most people know the story of the Trojan Horse, that it was a trick, really. It was Odysseus who thought up the idea. Because the Greeks had got to the end of their tether, really. They'd been laying siege to Troy for 10 years at that point, and they just couldn't defeat the Trojans, so they came up with this trick. And most people do know that, but there are other elements to the wider story. I've called the fourth book The Oracles of Troy, because what a lot of people don't know is that before the Greeks could go ahead with this ruse, the Trojan Horse, they were set a number of oracles which were given to them by the gods, which had to be fulfilled before the gods would allow Troy to be defeated. So the first half of the book is all about how Odysseus goes about fulfilling these oracles, and a lot of people don't actually know that bit. I mean, there were different theories. The Romans used to think that the Trojan Horse was a siege engine, like a siege tower that was pushed up against the walls, which is a very interesting take, but I've gone for the more traditional view.
Yeah. And do you know how many more books there's going to be? Because you're already working on the next one, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm about just over halfway through the fifth book, but there will be a sixth as well eventually.
Okay.
So I planned them all out at the start. The next book, the one I'm currently writing, is about Odysseus' journey home, which took him another 10 years. He's been at war for 10 years in Troy, and he's got another 10 years of getting lost and encountering various creatures and witches and gods and so on before he can actually get home to Ithaca. And the sixth book will be the tale of his actual return home.
Mm. And because, as you said, there's lots of different myths that are out there about the same events or the same people, will there be people, you think, reading your books and saying, oh, hold on a minute, that's not right, I read something else?
Yeah, I did. I came across a website from a chap who'd read the books, and although he'd really enjoyed the books, he was pointing out a couple of myths that he thought I'd got wrong. But actually, there are lots of different takes on different elements of the story, so it's quite nice. It's like being in a sweet shop, really. You can choose the myths, the outcomes that you really want, and I try to choose the ones that better suit the story I'm trying to tell. So almost everything in there, in the series of books, is from a myth. Yeah, there is a myth behind them all.
Yeah. And something completely separate that I have to ask you about, because it mentions in your biography about all the different travelling that you've done. And I have always wondered what kind of crazy person would run with the bulls in Pamplona. Well, you are that person, aren't you?
Yes, I am, unfortunately. I think it was one of those combinations of being young and perhaps having a few too many beers the night before. We'd gone to Pamplona. I'd gone with some friends to have a look and see what it was all about. And yeah, as I say, being young and perhaps a little bit stupid, we decided to go for the running of the bulls. And yeah, I got caught by a bull and tossed in the air. It was actually within the bull ring, because you go through the streets and then all the streets are fenced off, and the bulls are sent into the bull ring, and all the people who do the running follow it through. And inside the bull ring, the seats are all filled with onlookers. And I remember as I was tossed into the air, there was a great big olé, and then I remember hitting the floor sort of head first and breaking my collarbone.
Oh,
yeah, it's still broken there. It's still never set right.
And what happens then? I mean, how do you get off the floor in time before it tramples all over you?
Oh, I think it had done me, and it had gone on to its next victim. So I sort of pulled myself up onto my feet. I didn't realise it was broken at the time, although it did grate a little bit and didn't feel quite right. So I went round to the entrance to the infirmary, and just went in there. I was treated by a doctor there and sent off to a hospital. And I shared the ambulance with an 11-year-old boy, an American lad, who'd actually done the running with his father. And he'd got separated, and he'd been trampled by a bull, and the doctor had actually said he'd possibly broken his back.
Oh,
but fortunately he hadn't. When we got to the hospital, I sort of stayed with him and saw how he got in, but he hadn't broken his back, fortunately, but he was still lost from his father.
And after going through that experience, do you still think it seems like a fun, crazy thing to do, or...?
No, I think it's completely mad, really. I'd never do it again. I wouldn't do it again. I get scared in a field full of cows now.
I bet. Oh dear. Well, if people want to get a copy of your latest book, it's called The Oracles of Troy. It would make sense for people to start at the beginning, wouldn't it?
Well, I always write the books so that anybody can pick them up at any stage. So it's a story in its own right. If anybody just wants to read my take on the story of the Trojan Horse, then they can pick this up and they won't be confused by not having read the originals. And they can then go back to the originals if they want to.
Sure. Fantastic. Well, the first one's called King of Ithaca. And they are all by Glyn Iliffe, who we've been chatting to today. Glyn, thank you ever so much for joining us.
Thank you, Hannah.